Hello and welcome to the ECN Backbenchers, a series of outputs created by the Political Studies Association's Early Career Network, for and by early career researchers. Today marks our first episode of a new YouTube hosted show, as you can see, titled Backbenchers. In this show, we hope to showcase the best research from our ECN members, but also to provide advice and so on. We can't always promise that we're going to be regular, but if you're interested in coming to the Backbenchers, pop us an email. You'll find our contact details in the description. The ECN and the Backbenchers itself is organised through early career researchers like you. The ECN is committed to supporting both PhD students and early career scholars, that's 3 years after your Viva, and is a space that specifically addresses the interests and needs of postgraduates and early career researchers in an independent, peer-based environment, while getting the best support and wider guidance from PSA. Membership is only £20 a year and provides you with full access of Political Studies Association benefits, which also allows you to access PSA exclusive grants and reduced rates for some PSA events. You'll find details of how to join on the description below. Today we're going to talk about publishing, turning your research into a book, with today's host and ECN Communications Officer, Dr. Liam McLaughlin. Today we have in the show Dr. Julianne Viola, currently a postdoc at Imperial College London Centre for Higher Education Research and Scholarship. Dr. Viola has a really interesting background. She's a Cornell and Harvard alumni, and she did her doctorate at the University of Oxford. Her PhD focused on young people's civic experiences in contemporary American society and how they navigate the political world in an era defined by digital media. This work has now been published as a book by Springer under the title Young People's Civic Identity in a Digital Age. No doubt an extremely interesting subject in the context of 2020. Julianne, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
How are you doing today?
Oh, very well, thanks. I'm looking forward to my daily exercise because it's a sunny day. It's quite warm as well, so I'm thinking an early evening walk will be a good reward for the end of the working week.
And as like a reward for doing the podcast maybe as well.
Oh yes, of course.
So, Julianne, as I mentioned previously, your research looks on the formation of political identity amongst young people. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Of course. So my primary research focus is on how young people, particularly adolescents and teenagers, develop their identity and more specifically their civic identity. And what I mean by civic identity is how a person identifies as a citizen or as a member of a community and how they engage in that community. So I'm most interested in qualitative research, and I really appreciate different backgrounds and perspectives that I can learn through processes like interviewing, and that I can also share in my publications. And that was a primary motivator for why I wanted to turn my thesis into a book, because I interviewed 46 young people from the United States between the ages of 14 and 17 years old, just before the 2016 presidential election. And it was important to them and important to me that I get to sort of help be a medium through which they can share their voices with the wider public.
Excellent. So you said your research is from 2018, or before 2016 rather. So what kind of lessons could you transcribe from that into 2020? Is there any significant difference from back then to today?
So what I'm noticing, or what I found most striking in my research, was that many young people often actually hadn't been asked the types of questions that I was asking them about their own views of what it means to be a citizen and what it means to be civically engaged, and also what their opinions on certain political issues might be. And that was a really resonant theme throughout my research, and even today, is that young people's voices aren't often heard in the ways that they should be. And as academics and as educators, it's really important that we listen to our students and also take the time to help kind of raise those voices and those on the platforms that we have. Now, something that's really interesting, something that I found through my research, is that even in the digital age, when we have access to social media, even then, a lot of the time, young people feel like their voices aren't being heard, even if they are sharing them on social media. So I would say that even though 4 years have passed since I interviewed those young people, and now what's exciting is all of them will be eligible to vote in the 2020 presidential election. So I wish I could follow up with them and
Yeah.
talk more about how they're feeling about that. Um, but some of these sort of themes and principles still apply, that young people feel unheard and they really ought to be heard.
That's really interesting. So, my own research looks at how social media is changing political representation. And a lot of the academic arguments, especially like the early day stuff, is that digital media is going to make people feel more empowered, it's going to make them more politically active, it's going to make them more
Mhm.
politically vocal. Um, and you're saying is that social media isn't kind of giving them benefits as you'd expect?
Yeah. So what's surprising is, social media is a great tool to help one sort of figure out their identity, following different people depending on what sort of viewpoints they're sharing, or, what kind of maybe dance moves they have, and you want to try to imitate their dance moves. I feel like TikTok is the big thing these days.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm sorry, what was the question again? I might have
It's
to edit
fine.
this out.
No, it's fine. So, my own research looks at social media and political representation, and a lot of the like early academic arguments we found from that were that the internet is, especially on digital, other sorts of digital media channels, are really going to make people more participatory in politics. It's going to encourage them to be more vocal. It's going to go out there and make them more politically active. So, what does your research say about kind of what social media is doing for making people more politically or less even politically active?
Mhm. So, social media really mediates the sort of political participation experience that we all have. So, not just young people. And while I mentioned before that one of the key findings from my research has been that despite the platforms of social media, young people still feel like their voices aren't being heard, but they can also still find out about what current events are going on. They can read up on certain current events and political issues and social issues that they care about, and follow those issues on social media. So, for example, following the hashtag for Black Lives Matter, or the March for Our Lives, for gun control in the US. So there's lots of ways that the experience of understanding and learning about what's going on in the political world have been mediated by social media. So even if you might be sharing your political opinions and not necessarily feeling like you're being heard because you only have 10 followers or whatever, um, it's also about consuming information and consuming messages from other people. So um, another example is finding out about different protests and ways of becoming involved and signing petitions online and that sort of thing.
Yeah. That's all really interesting. I can envisage myself being able to sit with you for days and talk through this research because it's kind of what interests me. It's probably interested a lot of people. But let's go back to what our audience are probably really interested in, the main subject of this podcast, which is how you managed to successfully transfer your PhD into a book. And like for many people, that's the goal. And it seems like a mythical unicorn. It's something that other people do, even sort of thing. So, can you tell me a bit about how, when you started to think about getting published, what were your first steps, and how did you even start thinking about a publishing strategy?
That's a great question, and kind of a long story, but I'll try and make it brief. I first started thinking about publishing from my thesis very early on in my PhD. I remember during my first year in one of our research group meetings, the Learning and New Technologies Research Group in the Department of Education at Oxford, we had been discussing the opportunity to write a thesis by publication. And this was sort of a debate that we were having, over the course of maybe one term. Um, and everyone in the group had decided that it wasn't really the best route for the type of research that we wanted to conduct, because most of us had, needed to take quite a bit of time to conduct field work and interviews and then analyze all of that data. Um, so we all pretty much decided that we'd focus on writing a thesis first and then think about publishing later. And for me, that suited me very well because while I'm able to multitask, I usually like to focus on one thing at a time. So focusing on the thesis as a whole before moving to publishing made sense to me. And it wasn't until I was about, I don't know, a few months into writing up my thesis in my final year that I started really thinking about publications. I attended a few very helpful workshops that were put on in Oxford by a variety of different publishing houses on how to turn your thesis into a book. So I first chatted with editors at Taylor and Francis about turning my thesis into a book, but that's only because they were the first workshop that I attended. And during that workshop, they sort of explained the publishing process with them, what you need to do to submit a proposal. And we had the opportunity to talk to some editors there about our idea for our books. And I got some very positive feedback from that. And I was advised to get in touch with a certain editor after I submitted my thesis and after I had the Viva. But as I'm sure you remember, the craziness of submitting a PhD thesis and preparing for the Viva and finishing the Viva and applying for jobs and then starting a job, all of this, craziness of this transition kind of caused me to forget about publishing. But it was kind of funny because in the end, I was approached about a week before the 2019 PSA annual conference by a commissioning editor from Palgrave Macmillan, which is an imprint of Springer. And she had seen that I was going to give a paper on youth political socialization in the digital age and asked if I would be interested in contributing a book to the Young People in Politics series with Palgrave Macmillan. So I met her and one of the series editors at the conference, and it seemed like a book based on my thesis would be a good fit for the series. And I mentioned before, I was really motivated to publish quickly because my data had come from 2016. So I really wanted to get this out there before the next presidential election in the US. And the overall timeline from my editor approaching me last April at the PSA conference to the release date of my book was exactly 11 months, which is very, and I think most would agree, unusually quick.
Yeah, definitely. So you can attribute part of your publication down to the Political Studies Association then?
Oh, definitely, 100%.
That's like totally a
Thank you,
self-plug right
PSA.
there. Yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the questions I hear, and probably something listeners might be interested in too, is selecting a publisher. Is there certain things a PhD student or early career researcher should be looking for in a publisher?
So I would recommend first and foremost that you look for a publisher that would be the right fit for your book and also your audience. So do some research on whether there are particular series that your book might be best suited for. So as I mentioned, I didn't really have to do this part of the sort of research phase before publishing because I was approached by an editor. But I, of course, before deciding actually to submit a proposal, I did quite a bit of, poking around on the website and learning more about the series and the other books in the series. I had noticed that many of the authors who had published in this particular series were those who I had cited in my own work, and that really encouraged me that this was going to be the right fit for where my work would be disseminated. I would also say that you should know that you shouldn't have to pay to publish your book unless you're publishing open access. So talk to the publisher directly about that because they each have their own sort of open access policies and plans, and your university might be able to help support you with that if that's a route you wanted to go down. It is quite expensive, and I couldn't afford it on my own, and my university wouldn't support me in that particular endeavor. So I ended up not going with that option. But so that kind of leads me to the next point, which also involves money. And it's not necessarily something that you have to look for per se, but something definitely to be aware of is as an author, you're going to be doing a lot of work and you're going to feel like you're not getting paid for it. So some publishers will offer a single lump sum payment at the time of the publication of your book, which is what happened in my case. But Others offer a small percentage of royalties from book sales, ranging from usually about 2.5% to 5%. And actually, on that note, one of my colleagues recently told me about the Authors Licensing and Collecting Society, which pays out royalties for your writing as well. So, in addition to what royalties you might get from your publisher. So, on that note, I would recommend checking out the it's acls.co.uk for more details.
Thank you. So, in terms of you spoke a little bit before about you shouldn't have to pay to have your work published, and we all know about the plague of predatory like publishers and academia. Are there any quick tips for being able to avoid them?
This is one that I actually have to think about because it's not something that I needed to worry about myself. But I would definitely say that, I mean, if I were to publish another book now, I would be looking out to make sure that I wasn't being asked to submit too much without signing a contract. I think it's really important to, as you're doing research on what publisher would be appropriate for your book, you will find on their websites that they have very clear guidelines about submitting proposals. Some of them want to be the only publisher that has your proposal at one time. So if you want to shop around, that could be quite a lengthy process. But I would, be careful if anyone asks you for money. Don't give anybody any money. And also, if they're asking for more of your work, and I don't know, you can kind of get a feeling of when something kind of feels off, but definitely stick with, I would say, like, go with the the publishers that you've heard of for sure. I wouldn't probably go with like maybe small independent publishers. I don't think that would be necessarily the right fit for an academic book, but that's just my opinion. So another tip would be to talk to senior academics that you know personally, like mentors or maybe your PhD supervisor or another trusted colleague, about their experience with publishing. And if anything seems questionable, run it by them, because it's always good to have like another pair of experienced eyes kind of look things over.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So what this next question is going to be about is, so put yourself into the shoes of some of our audience members, like, early career PhD students, or maybe they've just submitted their thesis. What steps or what's the process of getting that into a book?
So I can think of probably 5 steps. We'll keep it to 5. So first, I would have a think about whether a book is the best way to disseminate your work. Talk to your PhD supervisor and a few other colleagues who know your thesis very well to help you make that decision if you're not so sure. For me, I felt like my thesis kind of, read very well as like a single story. There was a very clear narrative that I was trying to share, and that lended itself very well to become a book. In some cases, it may make sense to publish a couple of different articles, but I think something that's important if you're thinking about turning your thesis into a book is that sort of overarching narrative, and sort of like what is the main argument that you have, and does most of your thesis suit that argument well for a book. The second step would definitely be to research publishers. So we've talked a little bit about this throughout our conversation already, but a good place to start is to have a look at your literature and even your references in your thesis and see which publishers are mostly cited in your thesis. So is it Sage? Is it Springer? Is it Palgrave? Take a look at all of these different publishers' websites and see if they have an appropriate series that your book would enrich by being a part of. Third, know that your thesis will require a bit of reworking and rewriting. And when I say a bit, I mean, be prepared from, anything from a bit to quite a lot. Don't underestimate this task. For me, while it took me, 6 months of full-time writing to finish my thesis, it took about 2 months to adapt the thesis into a manuscript to send off with my proposal. So if you're set on publishing your thesis as a book, I would advise probably having the manuscript finished at the same time as you submit your proposal, so that you don't have to do too much more reworking after the reviews come back from that. And that leads me to my sort of next step. Fourth, reach out to editors with a short pitch of your book or even an early draft of the proposal. So most publishers, as I mentioned before, will have resources on their websites, including proposal tips, and even some formatting requirements that you can use and you should use. And alongside the proposal, most publishers will require that you submit a few draft chapters. So the proposal and the draft chapters will go out for review when they've been received by the publisher, and then it takes a couple weeks to a couple months for the reviewers to read it and then get back. And the reviewers will likely ask to see the remaining chapters after the proposal is accepted, which adds some time to the publication process. So I actually decided to submit my entire draft manuscript alongside my proposal so that I could kill two birds with one stone and speed up the publication process. As I mentioned, I was really motivated to get this out in 2020. And I also want to note, kind of in this sort of publication process step, that some publishers will also send the final manuscript back to one of the reviewers for a clearance read. They do this for books that are based on PhD thesis for like quality assurance reasons. So even if you've already published a book, if you're publishing a book from your thesis, it will go through this clearance read process. And of course, I've just been speaking about the publishing process, but my fifth step for turning your thesis into a book would be talk with editors in detail about their publishing process. And in particular, find out what exactly will be required of you as the author for and submitting your manuscript. So, sorry, I didn't mean before writing and submitting the manuscript, besides writing and submitting the manuscript. So, for example, I wish that I had known how much of the proofreading and copy editing I would have to do. That was a really good chunk of time that I spent to do that after my book had been typeset, and I sort of expected that would be done, on the production team, but it wasn't. So that might be something that you want to know ahead of time from your editor about these sorts of additional things that you'll be responsible for before the book is finalized and released.
Brilliant. So when you talk about this kind of editing process, can you just tell me a bit more about that?
Sure. So do you mean like the copy editing process?
Yeah, like
or
how do...
Okay.
So like you submit a manuscript or your thesis and assume that it goes off to some editors who then typeset it into something that's more book format, and then it comes back to you. What's the kind of... How does that work?
Yes. So the process for me was I had submitted my manuscript in early December, and then it went off to the production team, who then typeset everything and formatted all the figures and this sort of thing. And then by actually, it was quite quick. Mid-January is when I got the sort of e-proof. So previously, authors were sent physical copies of their book to proof, but now it's all done online, which is a bit quicker. It took me a little while to figure out the e-proofing system, because it's sort of like Adobe Reader, but not really. And I like to read things printed out, so I ended up printing it out anyway. So it was many, many pages, which I don't really like to do because I'm very conscious of the environment and trees and paper consumption. But I spent... it was roughly probably 7 to 10 working days, full working days, to go through in detail every page of the book to make sure that it was basically perfect. I am a bit of a perfectionist, so that's probably part of why it took me so long. But at first, like I said, I had expected that all of this kind of would have been done before sending the proof to me, so that I would really just have to skim it, essentially. But after reading a few pages, I recognized a few typos. And of course, that was completely my fault because I was the person who typed the book in the, Word document that I sent off to the production team. But I was, once I realized that, I was like, okay, well, I really need to check through this thoroughly. So was a bit old fashioned the way I did it. So, I would make my notes on my printed pages and then input them into the e-proofing system. But, there was a bit of back and forth with the production team about what sorts of changes that they were actually able to make, because some of the formatting was just something they couldn't change because of the way the series is, and they want to keep everything consistent within the series, that sort of thing. But, overall, I'm very happy with how everything turned out. But like I said, I think, it is, good to know. Like, now I know for future books, should I write them, that I'll have to set aside some time after the submission of the manuscript just to make sure that I have that opportunity to thoroughly go through it and make sure it's proofread and copy edited to my satisfaction.
Yeah. So one of the bits of advice I was given as a PhD student rather, was that writing a PhD thesis is like writing nothing else, and nothing actually quite compares to it, not even a book, not even a journal article. So how different is your book to your actual PhD thesis?
So to be totally honest, it's not that different from it. I had submitted my thesis in September, and then I started working on it as a book in April. So it was about 7 months or so that I had a break from looking at the thesis, which was very, very helpful. And I say that because when you're writing a book, it is for a different audience than the thesis, because your thesis is really written with your two examiners in mind, usually. But a book has, anybody could read it, which is very exciting. So, I did have to sort of change the tone. I revised quite a few of the chapters. I even took a whole chapter out. So there was a, substantial reworking of the thesis, but overall, the argument is more clear in the book, as well as, the sort of kind of tone, and it's not entirely for a general audience. It's still very much for an academic audience, but hopefully, even, undergraduates might, be able to read it and use it in their research. So it's not, too academic. It's just the right amount of academic.
So finally, is it worth it? Is all this hassle you went through to get it published, is it worth it?
Definitely. I would do it again. Hopefully with the knowledge that I now have. But it was, I think it was a really good experience. And I think that speaks to my editors. So I'll give a shout out to Umbra Finatello and Catherine Birchley-Braun at Palgrave Macmillan. They were absolutely wonderful and a pleasure to work with. And I think that, really helped the process along. Anytime I had a query, they were, able to answer it right away, or if they didn't know the answer to it, they would find someone who did know, and they would still get back to it within like 24 hours. So they made the process really much easier for me. And also, I just love writing. So it was really fun to do. I would do it again.
Brilliant. So, our final question, and this is a really important one, so you've got to really think long and hard about this one. Let's talk conferences. Would you rather go to a really boring conference, but it's somewhere exotic like Hawaii, or would you go to a really fascinating conference, but it's in Hull?
I think I would definitely pick a boring conference somewhere exotic, because then there's 2 excuses to skip some talks and go exploring.
Yeah, there we go. Well, Dr. Julianne Viola, thank you so much for coming on speaking with us on the ECN Backbenchers podcast. Your insight, hopefully, is going to prove invaluable to many of our other audiences. And I look forward to hearing from you in the future and more of your research.
Thanks, Lee. I'm looking forward to staying in touch and hearing more about your research, too.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, that's a wrap for this first episode of the ECN Backbenchers, a series of outputs created by and for early career researchers like you. The Backbenchers would not be possible without the ECN membership, so if you're interested in joining for only £20 a year, make sure to check out the link in the description. Thank you for tuning in. Make sure to check out our social media channels in the description, follow us on Twitter, and join our Facebook group. If you want to see more content from our ECN members, make sure to check out our YouTube channel and subscribe, where you can find full presentations from our last virtual conference, #BecauseTheInternet, including a special keynote speech from Pippa Norris. I've been your host, Dr. Liam McLaughlin, and on behalf of all of the ECN committee, we'll see you next time.